Welcome to SDSN. SDSN stands for Sustainable Development Solutions Network. The SDSN was set up in 2012 under the auspices of the UN Secretary-General to mobilize global scientific expertise to promote practical solutions for sustainable development, including the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Our mission is to promote integrated approaches to implement the SDGs and the Paris Agreement on climate change through education, research policy analysis, and global cooperation. The SDG Academy is SDSN's online education platform that creates and curates free educational resources on sustainable development. The courses cover the headline issues and a multitude of interdisciplinary topics related to the 17 SDGs. The Secretariat and SDSN's 1,300-plus member institutions support planning, policy development, and implementation of these international commitments through a number of projects. Our Sustainable Development Reports house our SDG index and dashboards, data analysis tools that use publicly available data to track progress on the SDGs at the national, regional, and local levels. The annual World Happiness Report surveys the state of global happiness and ranks countries by their happiness levels. The Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use, and Energy Pathways Consortium, or FABLE for short, is composed of 22 regional and country teams developing coordinated national long-term pathways towards sustainable land use and food systems. SDSN also houses several thematic networks, groups of experts mobilized around a specific topic within sustainable development, such as data, climate and energy, sustainable cities, and sustainable agriculture and food systems. SDSN has over 1,300 members across 38 national and regional networks. In their respective countries and regions, SDSN's networks of universities, research centers, and other knowledge institutions translate the latest expertise in sustainable development into action. Our youth network boasts 20 regional networks in more than 85 countries, developing, promoting, and launching solution-based initiatives around Agenda 2030. Membership at SDSN is free and open to non-for-profit knowledge-generating institutions. Visit our website to apply to our global network today. SDSN is grateful to our sponsors and donors, without whom none of this work would be possible. Keep up with SDSN by following us on LinkedIn and Twitter, liking us on Facebook, or subscribe to our newsletter.
Thank you to Eden's Harmony for setting the mood for this momentous occasion, the launch of SDSN South Africa. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Tawana Kupe, Vice-Chancellor and Principal at the University of Pretoria and Chair of the SDSN South African Network. In his absence, our keynote speaker, Prof. Labode Pupula, Chair of SDSN Nigeria, Dr. Yolanda Steenkamp, Network Manager of SDSN South Africa, our panelists, whom I will introduce in more detail soon, the SDSN Local Leadership Council seated in front, Prof. Margaret Chitsiga Mabugu, Dean of the EMS faculty, and all other honored guests present. I'm humbled to stand before such a plethora of esteemed guests spanning across all disciplines, from the private sector to academia to presidency and higher educational institutions, all collectively and unanimously passionate about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and other development agendas in your various sectors. It is exactly this sort of cross-sectoral engagement that the founders had in mind when the Sustainable Development Solutions Network was created in 2012 under the auspices of the UN Secretary General. It was created to promote integrated approaches to implementing the SDGs and the Paris Agreement on climate change through education, research, policy analysis, and global cooperation. Today, we celebrate the launch of SDSN South Africa, broadcasted live from the Future Africa campus of the University of Pretoria. The objective of the national network is to mobilize and support South African universities and other leading research institutions to promote the SDGs in South Africa, as well as South Africa's contribution to the SDGs globally. The moderated discussion today will consider the role of networks in increasing the impact of universities in relation to the SDGs. 4 members of the Local Leadership Council of SDSN South Africa will contribute their perspectives of the sector they each represent concerning how networks with the universities might be leveraged in order to increase the impact towards attaining the SDGs. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Prof. Labode Pupula, who could not be with us physically today, but is joining us virtually. As previously stated, Prof. Pupula is the chair of SDSN Nigeria. He is also a professor of forest economics and sustainable development at the University of Ibadan. He has at various times been head of department, dean of the postgraduate school, the pioneer director of the University of Ibadan Center for Sustainable Development, and later the vice chancellor of Osun State University, Nigeria. He also served as president of the Forestry Association of Nigeria and president of the West African Research and Innovation Management Association. Please help me welcome Professor Labode. Thank you.
Greetings, everybody from Nigeria. My name is Labode Pupula. I'm professor at the University of Ibadan, and I'm also the chair of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network in Nigeria. I'm glad to speak to our colleagues in Pretoria on the launch of the SDSN South Africa. I've been asked to speak on higher education institutions at the center of multi-sectoral network for the Sustainable Development Goals. First is to felicitate with South Africa on the launch of this network. And I consider it a privilege to share my thoughts with you, and also to wish you a fantastic voyage as you launch the network in South Africa. We will look forward to further collaboration for our mutual benefits. We have common challenges, we have common opportunities, and I believe we can all share these and work together. We'll look at Africa's developmental challenges. There are quite many, almost overwhelming. We have issues of climate change. We have issues of ecosystem degradation. We have famine, gender inequality, weak political structures and institutions. If you come to West Africa, we're dealing with poverty at a very high level, youth unemployment, security, corruption is an issue, poor power supply, infrastructure, challenges of waste management, and ecosystem degradation. Going to Central Africa, there are huge socio-political instability issues, ethnic and state conflicts. We also have illicit drug issues, arms and human trafficking, biodiversity and eco-resources loss. Of course, in Eastern Africa, also some common challenges like food insecurity, poor infrastructure, exploitation and wastage of ecosystem resources. We also have man-made disasters and water and energy crisis. South Africa is probably a lot better than the rest of Africa, but we still have issues of high unemployment, limited economic diversification, poverty, we have income inequality, gender inequality, pollution, and climate change. Yes, so these challenges continue to take their tolls on Africa's development. Virtually every country in the world, and maybe worse in Africa, was affected by the epidemic. This figure shows the various effects of and implications of COVID-19. It affected livelihood in the area of education. It affected schooling. It affected health. It affected consumption, welfare. It increased poverty. It had economic effect in the area of public finance, exchange rates, firm closure, job and unemployment. It had global effects also. Oil prices got so low, and somehow they are coming up again because of the crisis in between Russia and Ukraine. We had supply shock, and we also had disruption of global trade. And if we look at it broadly, the creation and dissemination of knowledge, universities have long been powerful drivers of global, national, and local innovation. They have also been drivers of economic development and societal well-being. Well, how well have African universities been able to play this role? Now, the SDGs tend to play key roles in helping the universities to drive development. And the journey started way back in 2002 when we had the World Summit on Sustainable Development. In 2010, we had a summit on the MDGs. And in 2012, which we call the Rio +20, we had the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. And it also encompassed the views of people around the world. Now, this chart shows the SDGs process and progress. It's important for us to know this. It was a comprehensive decision-making process. We had groups and other stakeholders coming together. First, in 2013, it was about the world that we want. Now, the real journey started in 2016 with the implementation of the SDGs. Those were the years that the SDGs implementation actually started, 2016, and it's supposed to last till 2030. Now we are towards the tail end of the implementation, which we call the decade of action. So the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals is a new ideology. In other words, we're looking at shared responsibilities, we're looking at inclusiveness, we're looking at partnerships. It's also about sustainability. We can no longer operate business as usual. We're looking at prioritization, we're looking at environmental protection, and we're also looking at growth, in which case we're looking at the economy, looking at decent jobs, looking at accountability. Of course, the SDGs at the glance, there are 17 of them. This common knowledge, starting with no poverty and ending with partnerships. But the important thing is that all the goals are interconnected. You cannot take anyone out. All of them are very important. They are indivisible and they are interconnected. So there are opportunities in sustainable development. Inclusive development, no one is left behind. Universal development, the whole globe is involved. Integrated development, all of us are working together. No part is left alone. Locally focused development. In other words, you can look at any of the sustainable development goals and domesticate them. Technology-driven development, we're looking at technology. Technology has so many opportunities, and SDGs also leverage on these technology opportunities. So the next thing that I'll be looking at is SDGs and university leadership in Africa. Yes, we all know the critical roles of universities in the achievements. That's where we really have the academia. So the universities remain important for as long as they can contribute to societal needs. It is also no mere coincidence that the SDSN South Africa is also hosted in this institution. So I want to believe that you're good to go. I want to believe that you play the relevant roles that's expected of university. Now, the SDSN network is growing across the African continent. Like I said earlier on, it started in Nigeria in the year 2013. That was the first network that was launched on the African continent. And we have had several others. Now, our experience at the Nigerian network shows that there are huge benefits because you're looking at several universities coming together. We have developed the capacity of various stakeholders in undertaking what the SDGs are about, to understanding what the SDGs are about. And this includes top researchers. We have worked with religious leaders. We have worked with traditional rulers. We have worked with the mainstream media. We've worked with government, particularly the legislature and the executive. And I believe that SDSN South Africa can leverage on this to be able to work with all these stakeholders to ensure that South Africa gets the SDGs right. We have a partnership with the Office of the Special Advisor to the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria on the SDGs, and we're working to resolve some of the SDGs. So there are some sobering thoughts that I would like us to share as we move on this journey. The growth of Africa is not yet in line with the Sustainable Development tenets. We have growing income inequalities, social exclusion, we have youth unemployment, we have extreme poverty, we have insurgencies all over Africa. Democratic governance is increasingly coming under threat, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure you would have been reading about it. Most of West Africa, coup d'etats are coming back. Democratic governments are being overthrown. These are actually against the tenets of the SDGs. The world and the continent faces profound threatening health and environmental crisis. Again, the SDGs, I want to showcase a few situations that are worrisome about Africa, which I want to believe that SDSN South Africa will deal with. The urban population, these are projections from between 2010 and up to 2025. Lagos in Nigeria is expected to expand from 10.6 million to 15.8 million. Cairo is expected to expand from 11 million to 13.5 million. These are crises that are facing us and which we have to find ways of resolving. We also have the problem of internet connectivity, and we need this to be able to resolve several of our development challenges. In the area of literacy, if you look at the continent of Africa, we have some countries that have as low as 19% literacy rates. Niger is one of them. We have something as low as 39%, 32%. So what are the requirements for sustainable development? We have to ensure strong cooperation among the academia, government, and business. We have to ensure early development with inclusive planning and implementation logistics systems. We need to embark on aggressive literacy program for our populations. We need to embark on niche-specific development with technology-driven data systematics. Ending extreme poverty by 2030 is still a long, long dream, but we can try. Creation of dignifying jobs, providing universal health coverage, providing universal access to quality primary and secondary education, resilience building, particularly in area of disaster and its preparedness, urban sustainability of our major cities, agricultural productivity and resilience, particularly bearing in mind the impact of climate change, promotion of ICT-based smart systems for health, education, finance, and infrastructure. All of these are embedded in the SDGs. Now, I'm going to spend the next few minutes to look at insights from SDSN Nigeria. What exactly have we done in the last couple of years? For ease of our operation, we try to create some working and research groups. And these working and research groups are actually based on the 17 goals. We have a group one, the first group. That group looks at end of poverty, looks at end of hunger, looks at health, and it also looks at promoting sustained and inclusive economic growth. That is our group one. We call it a working and research group. They carry out research, they carry out surveys, they carry out development activities in communities. The second group is looking at two areas. Goal 4, ensuring inclusive and equitable and quality education, and also looking at a way of achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. The third group is looking at 4 goals. Group 4 is looking at, again, 5 goals. And the 5th group, the last group, is looking at 2 goals. So these are the 5 working and research groups that we put together for the ease of our operation as a network in Nigeria. So moving forward, the SDSN Nigeria is also championing the mainstreaming of SDGs in the curricula of our institutions. We are also trying to stimulate and engage in researches that will generate economically, socially, and environmentally relevant output and outcomes. And we're also collaborating with industries for research and innovation that will also impact this sustainable development. And finally, we are also working on data revolution, and this is very, very necessary. We are in the era of big data, and we have to take that seriously. We're working on that also in Nigeria. We're leveraging a consortium of universities and also research institutes. As we speak, we already have over 32 universities working with us, and we're trying to see how we can bring many more of them together and working together with the federal government. We're also looking at how appropriation may not just be centrally enacted, how it can be spread across many appropriation bills. In other words, each sector should have some appropriation made for it in the area of sustainable development instead of putting the budget in one basket. Government, academia, NGO partnership is not an option. It's the only way out. And in the years ahead, we should envisage a synergy that works among civil society organizations and all of us, leaving no one behind. I want to end this presentation by wishing SDSN South Africa good speed as we take off today. I would like us to stay in touch, collaborate, see how we can work together to ensure that the development of Africa is fast-tracked. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we'll stay in touch. I wish SDSN South Africa all the very best moving ahead. Thank you.
We thank Prof. Labode for those critical insights. I must say it's incredible to see what SDSN Nigeria has been able to achieve and the prospects of impact that SDSN South Africa has right here and the roles that we have to play to make sure that that does come to fruition. I'd now like to briefly introduce to you our panelist and moderator. Dr. Thandi Mwebi is the Vice Deputy Chancellor responsible for research, innovation, and internationalization at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Prior to her appointment at UWC, she was the Executive Director of the South African Research Chairs and Centers of Excellence at the National Research Foundation. She currently serves in the Leadership Council for the Africa node of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Thandi holds a PhD in Medical Cell and Developmental Biology from the University of Cape Town and a postgraduate qualification in Tertiary Education Management from the University of Melbourne, Australia. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Thandi. Right, we have Mr. Lawrence Matemba as well. He is the acting head of the Policy and Research Services branch in the presidency. The main function of this role is to provide technical and content support to the principals in the presidency, particularly with regard to policy coordination, integration, and coherence, enhancing evidence-based high-quality executive decision-making, and driving some of the cross-cutting policy priority initiatives. Mr. Matemba is also a PhD candidate at the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute and holds a Master of Commerce degree in Business Administration from the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Mr. Matemba. Prof. Peter Lenny is the J. Last Distinguished University Professor at the University of Rochester. He has been Executive Director of the World Universities Network since August 2018. Before that, he served at the University of Rochester as Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Sciences, and Engineering. Prof. Lenny is a neuroscientist whose research has focused principally on the early stages of seeing and how the brain encodes information in the eye's retina and transmits it into the visual cortex. His published work has contributed particularly to our understanding of how information about how the color of objects is represented in the brain. Welcome to you, sir. Ms. Shamila Subramani, the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, JSE, unfortunately could not be with us as she is feeling ill, but we also acknowledge her, well, with her not being here. Our moderator is none other than the Chair of the SDSN South African Network and Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe. At the end of the panel discussion, Dr. Heide Hackmann, Interim Director of Future Africa and Strategic Advisor on the Transdisciplinary and Global Knowledge Networks at the University of Pretoria, will provide a summary at the end of the discussion. Prof. Kupe, I'd now like to please hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amma. A very good afternoon to everybody who's here, and thanks very much for taking time in your busy diaries to be with us today. I think launch of this network is long overdue, but we can now get on with it, and also, as our colleague from Nigeria said, they are happy to collaborate. The panel has been introduced, but I just want to sketch small little context about what the panel will discuss. So the launch of SDSN South Africa is a network is of great significance, as today we recognize the importance of education, research, policy analysis, and global cooperation for sustainable development. Furthermore, with the University of Pretoria as the host of the South African network, the SDSN's core principle of mobilizing knowledge institutions and their associated expertise to generate and promote innovative and practical solutions for sustainable development is echoed. The objective of the national network is to mobilize and support South African universities and other leading research institutions to promote the SDGs in South Africa. After all, we are in the decade of advocacy, as well as South Africa's contributions to the SDGs globally, and that is why presidency is part of our initiatives. Today's discussion will be centered around the benefits and challenges and opportunities involved in complex partnerships. It's very easy to launch a network of this with multiple stakeholders, but making sure that it actually is integrated, works in a focused, strategically intentional manner, and achieves impact is not necessarily easy, but it's also not impossible. So the significance of transdisciplinary and trans-sectoral partnerships between universities is important. Let me just explain this, is that clearly if you look at the 16 development goals, although we tend to number them and list them, the truth of the matter is that they are actually not, they are not discrete. They are actually related to each other in an intersectional manner. What that creates is a very complex and complicated situation where you cannot address one and without actually, in a sense, beginning to impact on the other goal, to use a term that is associated with SDGs. What we want to do is to impact society so that we create a better, more sustainable world and societies. So I think we have a very esteemed panel here. I'll start with Dr. Mhwebi, because this panel is kind of not compliant with one SDGs, gender equality. It's 3 men and 1 woman. And so you can see what the problem is like when the challenges of the SDGs. Yeah. So Prof. Mhwebi, what is the value of university networks? And in particular, what are they capable of? What would be the benefit of universities entering partnerships with one another rather than acting alone?
Thank you, Professor Kupe. I must say that I prepared some slides and with a big Nelson Mandela University logo just to cement our role in this partnership. And we come here as an enthusiastic partner and an intentional partner, which I'm going to speak to about the value of networks. Yeah. Firstly, I just want to comment on research networks and impact. And perhaps just to take a step back and say, what is research impact in the beginning, before we even look at the value and pitfalls of research network in creating impact. Someone one day said, research impact is real change in the real world. And I would like to say that it's positive change in the real world, because research that is done is meant to impact society positively. and that requires change. And there are many different kinds of impact, including attitudinal impact, awareness, economic, cultural, policy. You mentioned policy yourself in your introduction. But that takes hard work and diligence to create that kind of impact from research, because you have to go through several steps to speak to different publics, to different audiences, so that at the end they also become advocates for research. So if I go now down to your question about what would be the value of research networks. Firstly, I want to make an example in policy making, as you have prompted in the beginning. By increasing the capacity of researchers, you're building a critical mass. And that critical mass of highly qualified and trained researchers is important because it can increase the quality of the science that comes out, and hence the integrity in most cases, and the legitimacy of the research, and also the visibility of the research to policymakers. Secondly, you give partners and opportunities to engage with peers and institutions outside your own country and your own small little network. And therefore, there is diversity that's being created. And also shared operational, human resources, financial resources, and then collective activities for fundraising. The mere existence of networks doesn't guarantee that they are successful networks. There can be networks that come in because we like each other. But if there's no goal of the network, then it becomes almost like a useless network, so to speak. And there are different constraints in enhancing those networks and the effectiveness of the network. Firstly, if we've got different countries coming together into a network, uneven representation in the network can be problematic. Power asymmetries come into play, limited funding constraints. I say this from my experience as well in managing multi-sectorial networks from my previous roles at the National Research Foundations, because you do see these power asymmetries playing out in establishing networks. And the other point I would like to mention, without taking too much of your time, there are certain pitfalls, as you have asked. If member institutions come into the network with no thematic expertise or uneven and levels and quality of expertise, then the network is, there's a problem with the network from the beginning. And also, sometimes funding agencies and funders try to match individual institutions without taking into consideration the power asymmetries, the uneven distribution that has taken into place. We've seen this playing out in our own countries with the centers of excellence and other networks that are national. So then maybe the question is, what needs to be done to ensure effectiveness of the network based from these experiences? I think the structural formulation of the network from the beginning is very important. The members, the importance and influence of the network, what will be the goal of that network? Secondly, the enablers of the network, the functioning of the network. What processes are there? Are they clearly spelled out? Are they clearly articulated so that members within the network are aware of these? And what would be the network goals and outcomes? If there are no shared goals, it's difficult for the network to function because at the end, you are not able to measure the success of the network. I'll pause there, Prof.
Yeah, again, no, very rich stuff to go by. Prof. Lane, I'll come to you, but let me just sketch something, because when Tandy was, Prof. Mwebi was speaking now, I was reminded that I was going through some of the networks that I belong to, on which I have a role. So I'm the co-president, or is it president or chairperson? Australia, we are in it together. President of the Australia Africa University Network. I'm also chairman of the African Alliance Partnership, which is Michigan State University and 11 African universities. I'm also the South Africa representative for the Austria Africa University Network, where there are only 2 South African universities and about 25 Nigerian universities, about 13 Kenyan universities. So there are some other geographic imbalances there. And then in the AAP is 1 American universities and 11 African institutions. So when you're speaking there, I could identify some of the things that you say.
Right.
And I hope that in this discussion we'll be able to.
Right.
Last week I chaired the board of the African Alliance Partnership, and an argument arose around the asymmetries.
Right.
Because the Americans were kind of saying that, yeah, we don't see the impact of doing writing together. And so we raised the question about, like, on the basis of what would you say that, is this the strategic intention from the beginning? So I set up a small working group to address that.
Right.
So Prof. Lane, if you can, with that background in mind, you are the executive director of the World University Network, of which UP recently joined in 2 or 3 months ago. The other South African university in the network is UCT, which has been there for a while. Then there are 2 other South African universities, University of Makerere and University of Ghana.
That's right.
And I think there's a total of about 23, 25 members.
25 currently.
Yeah, currently, but without any Asian universities. So if you like, what do you see from that vantage point, running a global network of universities? And when I had a meeting with you yesterday, you said that one is actually focused on the SDGs. So you are almost at the right place today.
Okay, thank you.
So could you, yeah.
Thank you. One of the interesting challenges about a network like the Worldwide Universities Network is dealing with what can often be problems of inequity. And I'd like to say a few words about imbalances that are often unspoken, but can be very troublesome in operating a successful network. Then I'll give you a richer sketch of some of the things we can do. Yeah. The most obvious form of inequality is, of course, in access to resources. And that's a major problem that networks like the Worldwide Universities Network, which draws most of its income from subscriptions, really can't do much about. But I think focusing on funds takes too narrow a view of inequality. And I think it also obscures really important areas of activity where members are all on the same footing. And I want to talk about these briefly. Let me first of all say a word about the broader conception of inequality. During my time as executive director, I've gradually learned about many aspects of inequality that are not at all directly related to resources. Historical presumptions, often implicit, about the global north and from the global north about the strength of universities elsewhere. In collaborative projects, casual and often damaging presumptions made about who sets the agenda and who sets the priorities. These are all things that coming from the north, it's very easy for people to either willfully or inadvertently misunderstand. And I flag this because the network can actually be a very positive force here. By supporting work to sensitize its members to the problems and to develop better ways of managing collaborations. And WN, some of you know this already, has a global Africa group that focuses on research problems related to Africa and Africa's engagement with the rest of the world. This is comprised of researchers who are particularly in this domain and drawn from the member universities. This group is currently driving a project that we hope will lead to recommendations about how WN can most equitably manage its initiatives. That is, we're expecting a rich and persuasive policy paper from this group addressed to the partnership board about how we should be doing business better. And that's one of the good things that comes out of a network. It would be very, very hard to see a reasonably persuasive path to a solution without bringing together the kind of people we're able to assemble for this. But having dealt a little with the troublesome side of inequity, what I'd like to do is challenge part of what's implicit in the assumption here. That is, I want to remind you that there are many areas of activity in a network where all members are equal and powerful contributors. And that's really what I think is the strength of WUN. You all know that the lifeblood of a major university is its intellectual talent represented in its academic staff and its students. And major universities compete very hard for that talent internationally. It's no secret that most major research universities that are competitive on a global scale have many academic staff who come from outside the country in question. Now, of course, it's the competition for talent is distorted by money. There's no question of that. But despite that, talent is very widely distributed and is increasingly concentrated in the south and the east, at least south and east of North America and Europe. And that means that universities in the global north have to be, and increasingly are, as a matter of necessity, engaging deeply and I hope productively with universities elsewhere. That's the positive driver here. But you might ask, with a major comprehensive university that's engaged globally, already active internationally, what does a network add? You know, you have, I was learning yesterday about a huge array of powerful collaborations that UP has with other partners, and yet you still want to be in the network. And I think your reasons for being in the network are aligned with mine for wanting you in the network. But I want to enumerate them a little. So the key value that a network can add, even for a globally connected university, is that the universities that are members, especially if you think about our network, where the only void is in South Asia, otherwise the globe is pretty well covered. We've got a void in Eastern Europe too. If you think about universities that are dispersed as widely as that, then they exist in different geographical, cultural, and legal contexts that not only shape how they support research and deliver education, but they also provide them with distinctive perspectives on many very important research problems. So if you think about the distinctive, in some instances unique, strengths that the University of Pretoria has, you see immediately that some of these derive from the university's geography, some of these derive from the larger national and cultural context in which the universities sit, others from the passions of individual academics who've driven the establishment of prominent world-class departments. Well, everything goes in this, but the upshot is that every major research university has an array of distinctive, if not unique, talents it brings to the table. And the situation, of course, the UP situation is multiplied in different ways across the network. Every university in it can point to some things that it does distinctively. The trick for the network is to harness these strengths into partnerships where people recognize what they need as complementary skills to solve real problems. So perhaps nowhere exemplifies the opportunities for a diverse network better than the SDGs. Why is that? Well, what's really striking about the research challenges of the SDGs is that these challenges can best be tackled by bringing multiple disciplines together, and very often in ways that are sensitive to geography and culture, because so much of what has to be achieved depends on changing the behavior of societies and people, getting people in societies to do things differently in coordinated ways everywhere in the world. Now, I must say right at this point, if you're inferring from this that WN is about a focus on the social sciences and humanities, nothing could be further from the truth. If you think about the problems that have to be solved, the problems, and by the way, here I want to emphasize that the way we think about it, which I think is well aligned with the way the university here thinks about it, is that you decide what the problem is that you want to tackle, often because you've got strengths you can assemble to make a distinctive mark in it. And then you assemble the skills you need to fix it or to make a move on it. What I want to do very emphatically is contrast this position with multidisciplinarity for its own sake. It's easy in some disciplines, and I've heard colleagues in disciplines I won't mention tell me that they're eager for multidisciplinarity because they want to escape the poverty of their own discipline. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I want to emphasize particularly for people who might think I'm ruling out the productive involvement of STEM fields, that's absolutely not the case. Most of the richest problems in sustainable development require collaborations across disciplines that almost invariably include STEM representation. The trick here, of course, is not to make the STEM representation an add-on on the side, dangling on the end of the discipline. I mean, that's why I'm generally opposed to the phrase transdisciplinarity, because it leaves people thinking that you're interested in the no man's land between disciplines. That's absolutely not the case. I mean, I prefer to emphasize multidisciplinarity and to point out, especially to nervous members of STEM fields, that what they bring to the table often comes from the core of their discipline. The trick, of course, is to pull them out of the core of their discipline so that they see how their core talents can be applied productively elsewhere. And the most successful projects we've had in WUN have often relied upon fortuitous, adventitious encounters with senior investigators in some fields who normally wouldn't be interested in the seniority of their career, in extending their reach, to realize that what they can contribute to a problem is really powerful, and they get engaged in really productive ways. So part of my plea to everyone here, especially the senior academics, is think hard about how you can engage productively with the problems, really interesting problems you never thought existed. So I've talked too much, forgive me.
Yeah,
the problems to be addressed, of course, by these constellations of talents are squarely in the SDGs, and that's why I'm delighted to be participating in the symposium.
Okay, societal impact. Now, Mr. Matemba, let me come over to you, because you are plump in the middle of the policy environment here. So my first question to you is, how are PA networks like the ones that represented by the three of us on this side, university networks and research institutes, how are they viewed, are they perceived, and are they considered useful in the policy environment, and how do you intend to engage them? I'll come back to my colleagues also to say, beyond networking among ourselves, how do we interface, if you like, with the policy environment? Because that is the traditional gap, that there's no shortage of knowledge in the academy and in research institutes, but it often remains there. How do we translate it into the policy environment and into society in order to achieve the societal impact we want, and that could be measured by how far we go with the sustainable development goals? Do you find this, our networks curious clubs of academics having nice wine and dinners in various capitals of the world?
Well, thank you so much, Prof. I'm kind of torn in between. Of course, I'm a doctoral candidate, but I'm also in the policy environment.
Yeah.
So I find
for us, that works very well for us. Keep it like that. Yeah.
So I find myself wearing different hats at any given moment.
Yeah.
But if to respond to your question, I'd like to take us a little bit back. Of course, we are now in the 60th administration. If we go back since 1994, most in all the administration, the constant feature has been the presidential working groups and advisory councils. So each of the presidents since 1994, during their administrations, have endeavored to reach out to individual academics. It may not have been necessarily within the networks, but at least academics, because there's a perceived role and assets that can be tapped into these for evidence policy making and in different roles that the principals are playing. So again, way back when I joined the presidency back in the days, it was during the presidency of Thabo Mbeki. There were, of course, a number of advisory councils and working groups, and one of them specifically was on higher education. So there was a structured engagement during that time between the executive and the higher education sector. I remember I was deeply involved in those. There were projects. And at one moment, the president back then challenged the vice chancellors in a meeting at Union Buildings. He gave an example of Limpopo, that look at the challenges that Limpopo province is facing. What are the universities doing to contribute to the solutions in there? Of course, it was a robust engagement and so on, out of which then followed concrete programs that formed the agenda of that engagement. Fast forwarding to now, in the current 60th administration, since 2019, in one of the first speeches of President Ramaphosa, I think it was a budget vote speech for the presidency, he put emphasis on evidence-making, evidence-based policy making. And therefore, it's linked to the resuscitation of the branch that I'm responsible for, because the idea is that this branch leads on thought leadership. It leads on interaction between government formally and research institutions and universities. So of course the branch is new, but the prospects are looking good. So one of the things that we have done now is to form the partnership policy support initiative between UP, GIZ, and the presidency. And already there are projects on the table around that. Now, reflect.
But Ms. Matemba, I must correct you. There is not just UP. It's, if you don't mind, if I can flesh it out.
Right.
We are the initiators, yes.
Right.
UP, the presidency, and GIZ. But the whole idea, actually, if you remember, and which the projects are not at UP owned, is what we've decided to do is to try and create a big database of all academics working in core issues that the sixth administration has prioritized.
All right.
And the idea, as you said at the beginning, is that then the presidency and your unit can then, when they have a project, make a call out. So the first call out, if you remember, I think the university that got the largest number of projects was UJ, not even UP. I don't know when you are releasing the next batch of the next batch of the projects. But the idea, colleagues, is actually to say there are often teams of colleagues working together, almost in the manner of a network, but informal, that they can then come to the aid of the president in these projects. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you for that input. So recently, just before this State of the Nation address last month, the president embarked on a series of engagements with advisory councils on the economy, on SOEs. The point there was that let them give him input into the State of the Nation address. So some of the input that we listened to came from these kinds of networks or associations. They might be informal, but really there is a firm realization that here's an asset we need to tap into, and from time to time it goes there. So some of the advisory councils are on 4IR, on climate change, investment, infrastructure, human resource development, HIV/AIDS, and TB. COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a cross-section of these engagements. There's a ministerial advisory committee on the pandemic. So and they vary in the formation and the structure and how they operate. But the potential is there. And Prof, you did indicate in your remarks that perhaps the issue is how to tap into that.
Yeah.
That's really the crux of the matter.
Yeah. So based back to Dr. Mhwebi and Prof. Lane, how could networks, if we have a receptive government, like say the South African, and it's not the only one, but we are in South Africa as SDSN South African Network, how should networks position themselves and what initiatives should they take to be able to fit into that capacity and that need for evidence-based policy making? Because otherwise, in the networks end up with, again, very rich interactions like both of you painted out, great peer sharing, great tackling of global challenges, but policy,
So
you know.
I wish I could give you a fully developed answer because it's an issue that we've given a lot of thought to over the years. But I can give you the pointers to what I think is the right approach to this. There are innumerable entities that set themselves up to offer expertise in solving problems. And so the barrier is high for a small network like WN to break into a space where people pay attention. I mean, this is not a problem unique to WN, but it's a problem unique, distinctive to small networks. Our approach to this, which we've been following for the last 3 years or so, is to be very hard-nosed about these things that we can do well and where we can assemble world-class expertise on particular problems that policymakers might be interested in. I can't overemphasize that there are within the network on particular problems, not a vast range of problems, but on particular ones that we've been looking at hard. There are reservoirs of expertise that are second to none. And so what we have to do then is tap these, producing maybe research papers, certainly policy documents that we would publicize, and bearing in mind all the time that much of what we want to do is to secure support for enlarging the studies. But it has to be focused on something that you know you do outstandingly well. If you don't do that, you're dead in the water.
So excellence, I think, is a way of positioning yourself.
You made the same point earlier. It's picking your target, confident that you can have a really good crack at it.
Yes, I just want to add to that point. You've seen within the continent, for example, many examples. In fact, even within universities, and I would say in the private sector as well, where we talk about best practice models. And those best practices are usually information taken from international networks to come and influence the way that policies are made. And I want to say the role of universities to make the networks more useful would be to integrate that knowledge to the local context, because that is where the network will become useful to society and impact society better. I'm not saying we're doing it well. At Nelson Mandela University, we started a portfolio, for example, of transformation and engagement. I've got my chair of council here.
She's in the council of the SDSN, so she's not just your council member.
We've started the portfolio of transformation and engagement, and it's a space that tries to deal with that issue of local integration and understanding the challenges of society better. And what that does, it provides an opportunity for converging ideas from the academic sector and the local communities so that the knowledge can be integrated. It remains to be seen what impact that is, because it's new initiatives, and they rely also on the ability of academic research networks that include international networks. That's what I think.
Might I give you an example of where I think assembling the right set of talents has an opportunity to make a real mark? So 3 years ago now, just before the pandemic struck, the Partnership Board, which is the governing body of WN, comprised of presidents and vice chancellors, was having an informal discussion, one of the very valuable aspects of networking. And one of the vice chancellors asked around the table whether anybody else was having trouble with student mental health. He had just lived through a short period when he had 3 suicides on campus. Now, it was no surprise that around the table you got resonance from certain other places. But what was really striking was that everybody representing every geographical region in the world raised the flag on the same problem. And out of that, WN established a working group that's close to completing its work now on developing an instrument for assessing student mental wellness in a culturally neutral way that will allow members across the network to understand better the scale of the comparative scale of the problems they have. Now, why is this likely to be particularly fruitful? Well, if you ask about how universities make interventions and what they're permitted to do, in several parts of the world, universities may not engage parents in the problem. Must not. It's illegal to engage parents in the problem. In other parts of the world, the university must engage the parents in the problem. And in yet other parts of the world, the law doesn't specify what the university can do. The university can basically take its own course in trying to approach the problem. Imagine what richness of approaches you get, given this cultural variation in how the problems have to be, often legally constrained, in how the way these problems have to be managed. And you get an enormous amount of wisdom that, in fact, we think can probably influence policy. For example, if being forbidden to tell parents results in worse outcomes than telling parents, one would want to study that. Yeah. I mean, it's not clear one could change policy, but you see the kinds of things that can come out of this comparative analysis, and we're hoping that developments of this kind within the network, where we pick problems on which we can assemble world-class expertise, allow us to elevate ourselves into this domain where policymakers want to pay attention to us.
Amma, you didn't give me a time limit, and I long for the days when I ran my postgraduate seminars, and we went on, until everybody said, "Prof, I have to go home." Have we run out of our time?
Yes.
I can wrap it up. Okay, fine. Let me wrap it up by something I will throw out, not just to the panel, but to everybody. In this policy conundrum, if I like it, part of the problem with universities or policy, even when networks are working in knowledge in universities, is that in a language that policymakers cannot access. So that's another challenge of how do we, is what I earlier referred to as a translation exercise. And so I think that has to be addressed as well, is for networks to think beyond doing the world expert, innovative science, excellent, well-published, well-cited among ourselves, but then how do we actually, in what forms should we present it? So at the University of Pretoria and also at the International Science Council, where I'm on one of the panels, we're engaged in a project where we want to actually, simplify is not the word, translate academic language and discourse into language policymakers and the generality of the public can understand. Because now we actually have competition, something we didn't have time to discuss, from the fakers of people who produce false information, which some of it reads just like it's produced by an academic and is packaged very well and moves very fast on WhatsApp and other social media. Or the urgency of actually translating academic language, information, and excellent analysis remains on the table. Because if that was possible, policymakers might better be able to uptake it, but also they might have pressure from the public who have this information at hand. So why does this not influence policy? So okay, I have to end it here and hand over back to our moderator. And also I see Dr. Heide Hackmann is standing up to make the summary.
Thank you, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, panelists. It would be remiss of me on day 2 in my new position and my first formal engagement as Interim Director of Future Africa not to say how privileged and excited I am to be in this role, to be at Future Africa, to be a member of the University of Pretoria, and to be back home. And I do want to thank the university for entrusting me with this role and for allowing me to work on science in and for Africa, which speaks to some of my most cherished ambitions. Thank you to the panelists and to our Vice-Chancellor for a very stimulating, thoughtful reflections, challenges that they have posed. Now, my role is to summarize, and I think it's fair to say that all of you have summaries of your own. You will all take different messages away. So what I want to do is just share with you is perhaps frame this discussion by sharing with you 4 key points that for me are take-homes. And they do all raise challenges for this new South African SDSN network. And by the way, we really need to celebrate after these discussions this great achievement, and my congratulations to the university, to the Albert Luthuli Centre, and to all those involved who have made this happen. So these 4 points all, I think, touch on issues that have been raised by the panel, and they set the challenge but also the opportunities, I think, for the network. My first point is what I would label as pursuing universal goals, but in a divided world. And I'm talking about the context within which we are launching this network, the context, the time that we are doing this, and the challenges that raises for a network of this kind. You know, it is worth repeating, we all know this, but it is worth repeating that the 2030 agenda is probably and potentially the most ambitious, the most comprehensive, and the most transformative development agenda that we've ever had in terms of international recognition. It's a unifying agenda. It's universal. It's for all stakeholders. But we do have to take stock and realize and remind ourselves that our unity has been deeply unsettled by the shock of COVID, of a global pandemic, and the failure of the multilateral system that we have seen in these last 2 years. And now by the shock of new geopolitical tensions, including a war. So in some ways, we have to recognize that the challenge for this network in South Africa, but globally, is that we need to think about how we overcome these new divisions. We are in a world that's perhaps more divided than when the SDGs were launched, and we all were very excited about them. And here, and that challenge comes on top of the fact that we're dealing with an issue of urgency. We're running out of time. The clock is ticking. And I think given this context, we can say that the role of science and science diplomacy is more critical than ever before. And of course, the universities as part of that. So science that crosses boundaries, disciplinary, sectoral, geographic boundaries. That's my first point, the context. Let's not forget the context within which we are operating. The second point is really to go now to what, science, the role of science. So at the International Science Council, we said boldly that the most important and the biggest challenge for contemporary science is to identify pathways to global sustainability and to assist in the creation and the promotion of policies and public action that will enable societies to travel along those pathways. That is our challenge as a global scientific community, and I think I would include now the educational sector, of course, in that. But it raises questions about what new imperatives for science, what kind of science are we talking about? What are the imperatives for science to deliver on that challenge? It's science that should make a difference to societies, science that should serve the global public good. That means we are talking about integrative knowledge production. There's not one of the SDGs that does not require the broad spectrum of knowledge from the natural, the social, the human, the medical, the technological sciences. That as much as the agenda is indivisible, our knowledge has to be integrated to match that indivisibility of the agenda. It also means we need to be literate in systems thinking. We need to be literate in futures thinking. And we need to be open. Open within the world of science in terms of sharing, issues of open access, open data, which have been around for a long time, are more critical than ever. But that openness is not just scientists talking to each other. We need to open the doors of our laboratories and libraries to society. We need to engage with decision makers, with activists, with communities. So open science, and the co-creation of solutions, what we call TD, transdisciplinarity, is a very fundamental part of this. But we also have to recognize then that those imperatives challenge what it is to be a scientist. It challenges science, and it potentially changes how we have to enable our science. And that's a real deep challenge for, I think, the universities in engaging in this kind of, and they need support from each other and exchange of ideas from each other. My third point is about the nature of partnerships. You know, the SDG space globally is it's a very well-populated space. There are many networks, there are many partners. And I think the challenge we now face, given the context, given the urgency, is what do transformative partnerships look like? Partnerships that lead to real impact, that make a difference. And I think some of the characteristics have been nicely highlighted by the panelists. So I would say the ability to successfully leverage insights and contributions across science and society. So again, the openness to diversity and inclusivity. That means we have to remain open to different ideas, different ways of doing things, different ways of thinking, different perspectives, different people. And bringing all that diversity in right from the beginning. Equality has been mentioned. I think this is fundamental, that at a network like this, there has to be joint visioning, joint goal setting, and joint governance and joint agreement on what it is we can do together. And for me, most importantly, because in my career, I've had the fortune of signing many MOUs, and so many of them, embarrassingly, are empty. We need partnerships that are action-oriented. It needs to be about action and the commitment to act. My third point, actually no, that was my third. My fourth point is about recognizing that we all believe in the value of partnerships, and it's a goal in itself in the Agenda 2030. But I think it is important to recognize that there is a tension always in our yearning to collaborate and our need as human beings to be part, to belong to something. And academics belong to different homes. They belong to their disciplinary homes, they belong to their institutions. And so there is a bit of a tension. And partnerships, a successful partnership, has to manage that tension. Because it's not, the tension can lead quickly to fragmentation, and with fragmentation comes competition for resources, including funding, and that's just an obstacle to an effective network. So let's recognize and embrace those tensions. Let's transcend again those boundaries between disciplines, fields, institutions, countries. Because ultimately, so we have our work cut out for us, but we know that if we look at the challenges, that not one discipline, not one field of science, not one institution, and not one country can tackle this on its own. And that's the value of the network. I just want to end up by saying that two things. One is, let's also remember the opportunity that we have as a scientific community with the publication by the Secretary General of the United Nations of the report Our Common Agenda, in which he announces his intention to re-establish a scientific advisory board. And that means that science has a voice, that there is a mandate for science within the policy domain. That's really positive. And as we launch this network and make it a reality and make it a success, I want the university, the Albert Luthuli Center, those who will be running this network, the partners, to know that you can count on the full support and input of Future Africa. Thank you very much.
Dr. Heide Hackmann, thank you very much. And if I may say, welcome home. And welcome to also this home, Future Africa at the University of Pretoria. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Good evening, friends and colleagues, and thank you for being here. Thank you also for allowing me a moment to be thankful with you and together with you to, firstly, our distinguished panel members, also our keynote speaker from Nigeria, and also, as I said to Dr. Heidi, we are aware that the energy and the time and the commitment that you made, we typically saw only the top of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, and most of your efforts have gone unnoticed. But please be mindful that we appreciate the sacrifices you made to share your experience and your insights with us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you also to Professor Kupe, both for your leadership as chair of SDSN South Africa and for moderating the panel discussion tonight. Thank you, Prof. To the members of the SDSN South Africa Local Leadership Council, those of you who find yourself physically present and those joining online, on behalf of Professor Kupe and myself, we are grateful that you have stepped up to make yourself available to provide leadership and guidance to the national network. And we look forward to collaborating with you and to active engagement as we take steps to expand the network in the following months. And then to the steering committee that has been overseeing the early activities of SDSN South Africa while the Local Leadership Council was being established. We thankfully acknowledge your time and your investment in ensuring that SDSN South Africa got off to a solid start. And allow me to single out Professor Derek de Jong, the director of the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute, whose vision of leadership reimagined has left a mark on a great many of us. And Prof. Derek also requested that I express his sincere appreciation for everybody's contribution to today's launch. And then to the members of our audience, whether you find yourself physically present or whether you are joining us online, your participation testifies to your personal commitment to building a future that gives expression to a way of being human that relates respectfully and sustainably to both economy and ecosystem, expanding our sense of community so that no one is left behind. And we don't take your presence for granted, and we count on you and your role in localizing sustainable development in South Africa and beyond on the continent. And finally, to the team, the organizing and production team, a force that is to be reckoned with, no effort has gone unnoticed. It has been a pleasure working with you. Thank you to our Assistant Network Manager, Mr. Jonathan Tager, and thank you also to Alma, Ms. Alma Akov, our Master of Ceremony for tonight. Isn't she wonderful? Let's give her a hand. Dear friends and colleagues and network partners, from my side, Kia leboha, siyabonga, danki, and good night.